Europe is back as a global superpower. Things have been set in motion that cannot be undone, and seemingly overnight on March 4th of 2025, Europe changed course, made its own destiny, dropped the shackles of obedience, and ushered in the era of multipolarity. This is something that I didn't anticipate, something that I didn't even want to happen, but it happened nonetheless, and now I'm making this video because I believe I finally understand why and how it happened, as well as why I failed to expect it. So hello YouTube, I'm Michael Size, and March 4th is the day when Europe published its 800 billion euro defense plan to be deployed over 5 years. This sounds like a lot, but it's actually a lot more than what it even sounds like. First of all, the money is coming on top of the existing defense budgets of member states, and these annual defense budgets are getting increased over this same period as well. Secondly, the money is going to be spent on buying European weapons, primarily, which are usually about 50% cheaper than the American equivalents that Europe was buying previously. And that 50% cheaper is true even now, before accounting for the manufacturing scale that this plan is going to add, and before accounting for the specific focus on lowering production costs. And thirdly, not only are these European weapons going to be cheaper, they're also going to be more versatile in terms of actually using them in combat, because all of the restrictions that you get on American weapons are not going to be present anymore. Most people don't realize just how tightly the US controls the use of the weapons that it sells. In fact, not only are the American restrictions going to go away, but European defense companies are specifically tailoring their products such that countries can choose to buy units that come with no legal strings attached at all, meaning that nobody is going to be able to restrict how a member state uses its weapons, not even other member states. On the surface, this might sound like we're just building 27 disconnected military-industrial complexes, but this is not the case. That would introduce inefficiency, so instead, the single market is being leveraged as much as possible, but still without creating the legal problems. In effect, what this means is that it's turning Europe into 27 fully sovereign military powers, all with state-of-the-art technology. And when it comes to the manpower that is going to field these weapons, well, the manpower is already covered by the existing defense budgets, so no extra spending necessary. The combined active duty personnel across the European member states is already higher than that of the USA, and remember, they cost less. So Europe is suddenly becoming superpower, but here's the thing, Europe always had the technological and economic capability to do this, so why not do it any sooner? Literally, they had the become superpower button, and European leaders only had to make the political decision to press it. So why did they not press the button earlier, and why did they press it now? It all begins with the Russo-Ukrainian war. At the start of the current hot phase in 2022, the US sent weapons to Ukraine, which helped Ukraine prevent a complete Russian takeover, and once the front line stabilized, particularly once Ukraine achieved victory in the Battle of Kyiv, Europe said to Russia, "That's it mate, you messed up, now freeze the war again so we can put all of this behind us." And I know that a lot of people don't want to hear this. They want to believe that Europe was always on the side of Ukraine victory because that's the morally correct side to be on, but this simply isn't historically accurate. Europe spent most of 2022 hoping for a quick renormalization with Russia. Regardless, Russia said no and the war continued. Now, later in 2022, following the successful Ukrainian counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson, Europe once again told Russia, "Mate, this is stupid, freeze the war so that we can all go back to normal." And Russia once again said no, the war must continue. And it said at this point in time when European countries started to understand what was actually happening here. Beginning in the fall of 2022, one by one European countries started to understand that Russia's ambitions are maximalistic in nature, and all of the evidence that has been accumulated between then and now has only strengthened this belief. Russia's ambitions are maximalistic. It will not stop after taking over Ukraine, it will not stop after taking over Poland abandon Romania, it will not stop after taking over Germany. In fact, it will not stop unless it is defeated on the battlefield. And one by one, as European countries begin to understand this reality, they begin to change their tune on the matter, because suddenly the outcome of the Russo-Ukrainian war directly decides whether or not their country is going to be invaded, something that raises the stakes enormously. And because avoiding an invasion is very, very important, now these countries want to flood Ukraine with weapons, give Ukraine basically every bit of kit that their soldiers are willing to field, in order to maximize the probability that Russia becomes unable to invade further. But the USA disagrees. The USA at some point begins a process that they call escalation management, which essentially means drip feeding aid to Ukraine, but never actually sending enough to end the war. During 2023, they pressured Ukraine to organize a counteroffensive, but without giving them the appropriate equipment, and so the counteroffensive made no strategic breakthroughs. This process of stalling bought Russia time to regroup with no serious pressure, and in October 2023, Russia began its new offensive that is still ongoing as of May 2025, and so far it has also made zero strategic breakthroughs. This whole thing was pretty bad. Beyond just the waste of Ukrainian lives, stalling like this is bad because the more that Russia doesn't lose, the more that Russia becomes likely to invade further European countries. I could give hundreds of such examples of what escalation management looks like. For example, the 2024 Russian incursion into Kharkiv Oblast, where Russia staged 100,000 troops and equipment on the border, but Ukraine was not allowed to use any American-made weapons to shoot at them until they actually crossed the border. Mind you, the border isn't in a field, instead it goes directly into the Ukrainian city of Vovchansk, whose Wikipedia page now starts with Vovchansk was a city in Ukraine. An entire city destroyed because the USA believed that shooting the troops staged to invade it would be too escalatory. Another example, in 2025, during the US negotiated 30-day ceasefire on energy and infrastructure, Russia carried out some of the most intense attacks against infrastructure of the entire war, and the US policy of escalation management allowed this to happen. The way that these strikes work is that they begin at airfields in Russia, where Ukrainian radar can see the strategic bombers taking off, they see them flying towards Ukraine, they see them firing their missiles, and they see them returning, and Ukraine would be able to destroy the bombers at any time using their American-made fighter jets or American-made surface-to-air missiles, but it turns out that American-made fighter jets and surface-to-air missiles are not allowed to engage Russian aircraft. So instead, Ukraine is only allowed to shoot at the missiles, but it also is not being provided with enough fighter jets and munitions to intercept all of the missiles. This is what escalation management means, and European countries are very much not happy with it. First of all, above everything else, this raises questions over the viability of US weapons if NATO itself were to get invaded. If F-16s are not allowed to engage Russian aircraft when flown by Ukraine, who's to say that they will be allowed when flown by Poland or Germany or even Canada? If anything, the US is dropping hints that these restrictions will extend to anyone who is fighting Russia. And beyond this worry for the future, escalation management is also a problem for right now, because it's hindering Ukraine's war effort, thus making an invasion of Europe more likely in the future. So the Europeans are not happy, but if they are this unhappy, if this is such a grave concern for Europe, then why are the Europeans not flooding Ukraine with weapons themselves? Why are they waiting for America to do it? Well, there's about 3 or 4 reasons for why this hasn't been possible so far, and all of them relate to a complex web of American soft power that is allowing America to block European countries from aiding Ukraine. Number 1 is ITAR jurisdictions on US-made weapons. A lot of the weapons that European countries currently have were manufactured in the US, and therefore the US can legally block these countries from re-exporting to Ukraine, or they can put other restrictions on the exports. Number 2, ITAR jurisdiction over EU-made weapons with American components. For example, the Storm Shadow missile manufactured in France and the UK uses American avionics, or at least all the batches prior to 2025 did, and therefore the US gains jurisdiction over how the missile can be used, and while the UK and France had approved it for use against Russian targets on Russian soil all the way back in 2022, the US was a holdout all the way until the end of 2024. Number 3, the threat of not recognizing Article 5. While several European countries wanted to flood Ukraine with weapons of 100% European production over which the US has no legal jurisdiction, the US was still able to prevent this by threatening these countries that if they send anything without asking for US approval first, and then they later get invaded by Russia, then the US will claim that the invasion was provoked by these aid packages, and they will therefore refuse to recognize the invasion as something that qualifies for the Common Defense Clause of NATO. And number 4, a long-standing US strategy of keeping Europe as a strategic dependent. The US wants Europe to be either unarmed, which keeps them dependent on the US for protection because they don't have the stuff to defend themselves with, or be armed but with American weapons, because ITAR jurisdiction makes the American weapons unusable without US oversight anyway, so it's the same thing. Now, Europe isn't stupid. It had no strategic autonomy, and it was fully aware that it had no strategic autonomy. So how come Europe was okay with this? Well, basically it's because the setup was transactional. The USA invests in a big enough military to protect all of NATO, and in exchange, Europe is quiet and obedient. So America gets control, and Europe gets to save money. Transactional. And this setup wasn't by accident either. I know for certain that Europe was aware of this being a transaction because Europe correctly used this feature in negotiations previously. For example, back in 2017, when America started pressuring Europe to spend more money on defense, European countries said okay, and they drafted about 3 different frameworks that all involved investments in the European defense industry. This was obviously diplomatic speak for if you make us spend the money, then you are not going to have control over us anymore. And the US immediately backed down because it didn't want to relinquish the control, and so the situation returned to the old setup. And finally, this entire old setup is also fundamentally why Europe expected the US to be the one to flood Ukraine with weapons, because after all, aid to Ukraine is just an extension of the same NATO defense mission, and the US should be happy that it gets to send only weapons, as opposed to if Russia makes it past Ukraine, in which case the US will also have to send soldiers and to fight the invasion directly. So again, from Europe's perspective, American escalation management looks an awful lot like America not keeping up their end of the bargain. All of this should be enough to answer the why of Europe's rearmament, but let's do a quick recap. We now understand that increasingly many European countries want to flood Ukraine with weapons because they want to prevent an invasion on their own territory. We also understand that the US does not want to do this because it considers it too escalatory or too expensive or some other excuse like that. And we also understand that Europe isn't able to do it without US approval because of the complex web of soft power that the US has been accumulating. And therefore, we understand at least one reason why Europe might want to pursue strategic autonomy, and it's because having their own weapons industry will allow them to arm whoever they want without asking America for permission. But how come Europe did not pursue this defense package earlier, like in 2023 for example, and why pursue it now? Why is March of 2025 the right time? The answer to this is a fine point about theory of mind, and it's something that had held the entire American soft power network together, and it goes like this. I am a European country, and my prime directive right now is to not get invaded. I believe that flooding Ukraine with weapons is the best way to minimize the probability of me getting invaded, but the USA disagrees. However, I also know that the USA absolutely does not want to go to war with Russia, and if I were to get invaded by Russia, then the USA would be forced into a war with Russia because it is a signatory of the North Atlantic Treaty, and therefore the USA absolutely does not want me to be invaded by Russia, so it must mean that our interests are aligned. I believe their escalation management is stupid and dangerous, but they must truly believe that it is effective, they must have a plan, there must be method to their madness. Notice how it's the North Atlantic Treaty that ties all of this together, because it is fundamentally what ties the interest of the signatories to each other, and consequently, the entire soft power structure unraveled very quickly once the USA made it clear that they don't have any intentions of honoring their treaty obligations under any circumstances. Now, I know that some people are going to argue with that and say that America didn't actually abandon NATO, that's ridiculous. Of course they will respect the treaty, what are you talking about? And I'll tell you what, here is the diplomatic language, here is my translation of it, you tell me if you can translate it any other way, because as it stands, I don't believe that any country in the world right now believes that the US would honor its treaty obligations if Europe were to be invaded. So, knowing this, look at how it changes the theory of mind from earlier. No commitment to the treaty means nothing to bind America's interests to European security. No binding means no reason to believe that escalation management is a serious attempt at keeping Europe safe, as opposed to being who knows what, and no belief in escalation management means deferring to the internal judgment of flooding Ukraine with weapons. Now, doing this requires strategic autonomy, and strategic autonomy requires a European military-industrial complex, and the Euro-MIC means no more obedience to the USA. This is how Europe became unshackled, and this is where we are today. So when people ask me how come Europe woke up so suddenly, this is my answer. The US abandoned its commitment to protection suddenly, and in response, Europe abandoned its commitment to obedience suddenly. This really is the only explanation that I've been able to find which answers all of the questions that I want to throw at it. When Russia and China first started to publish the multipolarity propaganda, I didn't believe in it, because I knew that the US had the technological and economic capability to maintain its status as a hegemon, and the Sino-Russian propaganda was based around the idea that the US didn't have this capability. So that propaganda was false. Now, I also didn't believe that the US would voluntarily relinquish this position, and I never wanted the US to do so either. I just wanted the US to grow a spine, flood Ukraine with weapons, and re-establish global peace and Pax Americana. But the US did choose to relinquish its global influence, so here we are instead, with Europe accumulating hard power at unprecedented rates. Welcome to the age of multipolarity. It didn't have to happen. Thank you for watching, like and subscribe.